So is everybody ready for this?
Yes, we are.
Okay. I'm really sorry we couldn't do this in person. I enjoy being directly in front of an audience, but I'm also getting familiar with this format. I teach a wetland class at Ohio State and in the fall, and had to do my class as a hybrid offering for students in the classroom and students who chose not to come into the classroom. So I've been doing a fair amount of virtual presentations. I appreciate the invite tonight and the opportunity to talk about wetlands. I will say that I've thrown a lot together here, and hopefully I don't overwhelm you. I can get a little academic, but I think this group is probably up for that, to really gain an understanding of wetland vegetation. So what I'd like to do tonight is do a quick introduction to wetlands and their importance as an ecosystem in our environment. And then I want to dig into some of the plant adaptations that allow certain plants to succeed in a very stressful wetland environment. And then I am going to kind of walk you through some of the different types of dominant wetland vegetation. And at the end, if there's time and you're interested, I have a short quiz just to kind of test your knowledge. I can't say that everything in this quiz is necessarily covered in the presentation, but I thought you might have fun thinking through some of the answers. And I think even if you haven't had direct experience with some of these things, you may have some educated guesses if we get to that point and have time to do it. So I want to mention sort of the plight of wetlands in the United States. We've had a dramatic loss in wetland area since European settlement. On average, in the lower 48 states, the estimate is about 50% loss. In Ohio, it's estimated to be greater than 90% of our original wetland resource that has been lost. And it was only after we did a lot of damage to wetland ecosystems that we began to realize that maybe taking those features off the landscape out of existence was not a good thing. And the first red flag that was raised by hunters was that the waterfowl populations were declining. Essentially, there's just no habitat to sustain them. And so hunters were noting declines in the waterfowl population. And as the science developed around wetlands, we became increasingly aware of ecosystem services, which I'll talk about in a minute, and established this national goal of no net loss of wetlands, which means that we want to at least maintain the acreage of wetlands that we have on the landscape now into the future. So we're not losing any wetlands. And that's what requires, or why we require what they call wetland mitigation. When we impact a wetland, we have to put another one back on the land somewhere so that we're not systematically losing this resource. So there was a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was put together by a specific committee looking at different ecosystems and the value that they provided, the services that they provided to humanity. And I've thrown a blue box around the wetland category. The larger dots there represent higher levels of ecosystem services. So if we look at inland wetlands, they are providing what they call provisioning services, such as food. Humans derive things like fish, shellfish from these systems. We also get fiber and fuel. A lot of cultures use reeds and things as a building product. Wetlands are very important in regulating the climate. They store a lot of carbon, and they're important in our water cycle. And they can also be used for cultural services, basically just interesting places to visit and recreate is another way that we can look at ecosystem services. So one thing that I like to talk about is our management of water resources. And nature used to do this for us in the form of wetlands, and we have replaced these wetlands with retention and detention basins, which pale in comparison to wetlands in terms of their aesthetic and their ecological function, which is why we're actively promoting restoration of wetlands in the landscape. And this picture was taken at Highlands Park, the wetlands here in Westerville, that we had the privilege to help the city design and build. And it's, I think, a really special place for people to connect with the environment versus something like this, which is a poorly designed stormwater detention basin. This area was actually improved with some additional earthwork and plantings so that it was enhanced for the community to provide a higher level of aesthetic and habitat value, as well as water quality improvement value. So if we get creative, we have opportunities to incorporate wetlands, even in urban areas where we're trying to store water anyway. We can make these into more wetland-like environments that provide multiple ecosystem services. And I'm not sure why that isn't. There we go. For some reason it's spinning. There we go. I don't know why there were multiple copies of that. Sorry about that. So when we talk about ecosystem services, one of the first ecosystem services that people might be familiar with, if you press them for what are wetlands good for, it would be habitat and biodiversity. Wetlands provide an abundance of habitat resources for a wide variety of wildlife. And there are some studies that have shown that about half of our threatened endangered species rely on wetlands at some point in their life cycle. So that's a very important ecosystem service, is the maintenance of biological diversity or preservation of biological diversity. This data is a little bit dated. I think this was like a late 1990s accounting of the threatened endangered species that were associated with wetlands during some point in their life cycle. And you can see, particularly for groups like reptiles, mussels, birds, and amphibians, that the percent of those threatened and endangered species is very high that rely on wetlands. And it makes sense when you realize what a drastic loss in habitat we've had, that many of those species associated with wetlands are now threatened and endangered because they just don't have the habitat to sustain them. So I just have a series of pretty photos here to kind of get you thinking about some of the wildlife that rely on wetlands. This is an American toad that I photographed at Boyer Nature Preserve. These will breed in temporary or permanent pools, and their young tadpoles will grow up in just a matter of months and then emerge from the wetland to live out their adult lives, only to return to the wetland to lay eggs in the next seasonal cycle. We have a lot of waterfowl. That's another Boyer Nature Preserve photo. Pollinators, I always get excited at Highlands Park because we have so many flowering plants. This particular plant is a gem. It's swamp milkweed, and very important nectar source. And of course, being a milkweed, it's also very valuable to monarchs and their caterpillars, which feed on the foliage. And I've actually read that swamp milkweed is considered to be kind of the top milkweed plant for butterflies. A lot of people think it's common milkweed, but the monarchs tend to use swamp milkweed preferentially if they can find it. We have a lot of aquatic organisms. This is a diving beetle, birds nesting in the cattails. This is a red-winged blackbird nest. Reptiles like the painted turtle. This photograph was taken at a site where we created an outdoor learning space for Reynoldsburg City Schools. And we were actually doing some teacher training around this habitat to kind of embolden the teachers to teach in that environment and understand what they might find. And we had set what are called funnel traps in some of these pools. As we were taking the teachers around, we were retrieving the traps. And at this point, the site was only about a year old. And one of the teachers said, are there turtles in here? And I said, no, we've not seen turtles, but I wouldn't be surprised if they showed up. And literally the next trap that we pulled had this little painted turtle in it. So that was kind of a neat story. And the teachers got really excited about that. This is a baby gray tree frog. And this was taken at Highlands, I believe. Still has a little remnant of its tail here. And it was out of the water, obviously crawling up on plants because it's ready to move on to adulthood, where they're climbing in trees and vegetation around the site. And this is just a general shot of the nature play space at Highlands, which is a great educational venue for kids in particular, getting them connected to the environment and having an opportunity to explore. And we've been doing a program for the city, educational program that we call Frog Fridays, that has been hugely popular, almost to the point of being out of control, because before the pandemic hit, we were drawing more than 200 people for this event. So it's been somewhat of a relief to scale it back a little bit, just to deal with numbers control for the pandemic, but really fun place to visit and explore and connect with nature. So I mentioned these ecosystem services. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but wetlands are always operating in the background, providing benefits to humans, whether we realize it or not. In some cases, those benefits are a little more apparent because we know we're taking things from the wetlands, such as food or fuel sources and that sort of thing. But certainly functions like carbon storage, flood control just kind of happens, and we're not necessarily aware of it unless we study these things and pay attention. But that is one of them, or those are some of the main reasons that wetlands are so important, and why we want to maintain our wetland resource. We have a lot of different types of wetlands, and every wetland is unique and will provide habitat for a unique assemblage of plants and animals. So this is a slide I pulled from a talk that I did for the All-Ohio chapter of the Soil and Water Conservation Society as part of an educational program for farmers, talking about different types of wetlands and how they help to improve water quality. One of the nicknames for wetlands is the kidneys of the landscape, because they are so effective at stripping excess nutrients and contaminants from the water. So they act as very versatile filters to improve our water quality. So what do all wetlands have in common? Well, there are three main parameters. And the top one is the hydrophytic vegetation, or wetland plants. And that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. But wetlands, in order to be legally and scientifically defined as a wetland, these areas are also going to have poorly drained soils, which we call hydric soils, and wetland hydrology, which can be anything from frequent inundation to a high water table, saturated conditions. It's really quite variable and dependent on the water source, whether it's groundwater, surface water, overbank flooding from the nearest stream, etc. Within the wetland vegetation, we have what are called indicator statuses that have been established. And I'm going to go into that in a little more detail. But the obligate wetland plants are plants that you would associate with ponds and deeper water systems that can't exist anywhere outside of an area where there's inundation. So we think about things like cattails and water lilies. But then we have this, this facultative classification, and these are plants that can establish in areas that maybe are just temporarily flooded or saturated. And depending on how wet the area is in which they grow, some plants are going to be considered facultative wetland plants, so they're a little on the wetter side of facultative, or they're going to be facultative, which are sort of, as I might describe them, the 50-50 fence sitters. They can have equal probability of occurring within the wetland or outside the wetland. And then facultative upland plants may grow close to the wetland where they can tolerate periodic flooding, but generally prefer better drained soils and less frequent flooding. And then finally, we have obligate upland plants, which will only be caught dead in a wetland, because if they're in an area that's too wet, they will drown out because they're just not adapted to those conditions. So upland plants are always high upslope from wetland areas. So we refer to these wetland plants as hydrophytes. And this photo is the College Knolls wetland here in Westerville. It was a wetland that the city worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to restore. They got some funding and restored this area. And what we see in this image, the dark green vegetation is a soft stem bulrush. And you can see in the upper left corner, there's kind of a shine on the water. There's actually some water lily out there that you can't see very well in the photo. But the dark green bulrush is an obligate wetland plant, as would be the water lily, and they're right on the edge. And then as you move outward into areas of less frequent inundation and maybe just saturated conditions, then we have a lot of our facultative wetland and facultative species of sedges and grasses, which is what's shown here. And if it weren't for the well-worn trail around the wetland here, we might have a little bit more of a transitional zone of facultative plants there. But the plants literally kind of distribute themselves across these environmental gradients in meaningful ways that are used in really identifying where the wetland boundaries are. The plants are one of our best indicators of the hydrology. So I mentioned stress in the wetland environment, and the biggest stress for the plants is anoxia. Basically, when a soil becomes waterlogged, the oxygen is rapidly lost. It either just bubbles up out of the soils, or it's used by aerobic organisms to fuel their metabolism. And it's because that oxygen is not replenished quickly, because oxygen diffuses very slowly through water. The system rapidly becomes low in oxygen, sometimes to the point of being completely anaerobic. So that stress and the stress of changing water conditions with water level fluctuations presents some significant stresses to the plants. And in coastal situations, you also have these salinity gradients. Depending on how close your wetland is to the coast, you're going to have different levels of salt. And depending on the time of day, when the last tide was, salinity is always changing. So plants have to adapt to these conditions, and they have some very unique adaptations that you won't see in more terrestrial vegetation. And I wanted to show you some of these structural adaptations. The first is called erynchyma, and this is just a very open structured tissue within the plant stem. and it serves the primary function of allowing the plant to get greater levels of gaseous exchange with the environment and push that oxygen. Plants can actually push that oxygen down to the roots where it's needed in an otherwise oxygen deprived environment. So that's Arenchyma. And this is a cross section here, a cutaway view of a soft stem bulrush. And you can see how porous that tissue is. We also have this trunk swelling that occurs on trees. If you've ever been into any of the southern swamps in particular, there are certain species of trees that when situated in more deeply flooded areas, they will become buttressed or fluted. The top image there is an example of buttressing, which is just kind of a broad swelling of the base of the tree. And then the lower image shows fluting, where there's kind of ridge-like structures that connect up to the roots that are spreading far and wide at a shallow depth from the tree, and it kind of forms this rumpled looking appearance. So that's another adaptation that they believe assists the tree with gaseous exchange, and also provides a broader base for support in soils that can oftentimes be kind of unstable because it's basically mud for a good part of the year. Wetland plants also exhibit a strong tendency for stem elongation. They can elongate their stems very quickly in response to periods of inundation. This particular example is with rice, and our wild rice would grow in a similar fashion. Wild rice is a wetland plant, and this graphic, this image, was part of a study where they grew rice with differing water levels, and the little arrows, the yellow arrows on the right, show where the water level was during the experiment, during the course of the experiment. And you can see that the plants that were grown in deeper water actually grew taller to kind of keep their heads above water, so to speak. The ones that were grown in lower water depths didn't grow as tall. And those plants just have that adaptability to adjust their height based on their environment and based on the depth in which they're growing. We also see what's called stooling, and this is where trees produce multiple trunks. And the reason for this is still somewhat of a mystery. There's some hypotheses that it is related to ice shear. When the wetland freezes in the winter, sometimes it will actually damage the bark of a tree, and a single trunk may die, and then it kind of suckers from there and grows additional trunks. And when this happens over a course of years, you may get these really irregular multi-trunked trees, but they call that process stooling. Then we also have these little openings in the bark of vegetation like the elderberry, which is what's photographed here, that are called lenticels. This is another means of gaseous exchange for the plant. It also occurs in mangroves on the coast. The mangrove trees have lenticels, but our best Ohio example of a tree with lenticels, or a shrub with lenticels, is the elderberry. And elderberries can grow in fairly wet environments and get the necessary oxygen through the lenticels to support the growth of the plant and the health of the root system. this is one that I've always found amazing. When trees and other vegetation are subjected to long periods of inundation, they can send out what are called adventitious roots. They'll actually send out extra roots higher above the soil level than would be normal. And they're basically putting these additional roots in a depth in the water column that allows them to be in a more aerobic environment. So they're getting some oxygen. The top image here was a site that I looked at in some strip mined areas. And this was down kind of in a valley that had been strip mined, and it had a very irregular hydrology because it had been dug out and it was associated with a stream channel that would flood into this area, and it would that water would reside in this area for months on end. This is a standard spade shovel handle, so probably 3 foot tall, and you can see roots coming out of the tree at that height, which told me, even though I wasn't standing in 3 foot deep water, that at some point during the year the water had been near 3 feet deep, because I know those roots grow just at the water line. So it's pretty interesting adaptation. I mentioned that a lot of times trees will send their roots out in the very uppermost soil layer. So in forested wetland areas, we tend to see trees with very shallow root systems. So if you notice on this image, there's no major taproot coming down. It's everything in the root system here is very near the surface, because that's the only hospitable environment for those roots. If the tree is growing roots deeper, they tend to die because it gets increasingly anaerobic as they penetrate the soil. So they tend to send the roots out widely so that they can take advantage of the periodically oxygenated soils at the soil surface. One more physical adaptation, structural adaptation, is what's called a pneumatophore. And the kind of colloquial term for these things would be knees. So on cypress trees, we have cypress knees. If you go to Highlands Park and see the odd knobs that come up around the cypress trees, that's what you're looking at as a pneumatophore. But I like to refer to these as kind of root snorkels. It's an extra extension of the root that gets up into the air above the water line and provides an additional means of getting oxygen into the plant's root system. Any questions on biological adaptations? If you want to impress your friends, remember the terms parenchyma and pneumatophore.
I do have a question as to how oxygen gets into soil in the first place.
That's a good question. If soil is exposed to the air, there's always a certain amount of porosity to that soil. So air can diffuse into the soil in any void. Things like root channels and worm tunnels and things like that open up the soil, and a loose structured soil is going to have a certain capacity for holding some air, and that would contain some oxygen, of course. Once it's flooded, though, those voids fill with water, and the oxygen is lost over a fairly short period of time to the point where the soil becomes anoxic. It would certainly depend on what the soil texture is, how compacted it is, as far as how much oxygen might be there. But generally, a healthier, loamy type soil would have a fair amount of natural oxygenation to it. that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So I mentioned these indicator categories. I'm not going to belabor this point too much, but we use essentially a probability analysis. So an obligate wetland plant like a cattail almost always occurs in natural conditions in a wetland. So the estimated probability that that plant would be in a wetland is greater than 99%. It's pretty much a slam dunk. If you see an obligate wetland plant, it's wet. And so this is one of those analyses that you can do driving down the highway at 65 miles an hour. If you see a string of cattail in the ditch, you can say there's a wetland there, because they really have to have the hydric soils and the wetland hydrology to exist. So you know that obligate plant is there, you know that technically that would meet the criterion for being a wetland. Then we have facultative wetland plants, which are in a slightly lower probability range for occurring in wetlands, but still on the high side, 67 to 99%. The facultative, which I said was kind of the 50-50, we use 34 to 66% probability. And then facultative upland and obligate upland are on the drier side of that spectrum. So I kind of talked you through this image, but we have obligate vegetation here, facultative wetland and facultative species here. And in the background, does anybody want to venture a guess as to what's growing up on the slope that looks kind of white and lacy? That's our wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace, and it is an obligate upland species. So it's sitting up on a rise well above the wetland in the background there because it can't tolerate the periodic flooding that occurs in the foreground. So that's that distribution along the environmental gradient. So I thought you might appreciate just getting a primer on some of the different wetland plants that we have, the groups of wetland plants around the state. I know everybody on the at the presentation here tonight is probably a plant person and very interested in plants, but I don't know how much you've been exposed to wetland plants specifically. So one of the sort of signature, maybe staple groups that we have within wetlands are the sedges, rushes, and grasses. And they tend to occupy a lot of space in wetlands, the grasses and grass-like plants. So in this image, we have things like sedges, and I'll talk about these in a bit more detail, and a lot of different grasses, but this kind of reedy, blade-like growth is what we're talking about. And grasses are pretty familiar to everyone. This is the structure of a grass. There will be a culm or stem. The leaves have a sheath that wraps around the stem. So if you've ever picked up a stem of grass with a blade coming off of it, you probably noticed you can kind of pull on the blade of grass and that sheath kind of opens up around the stem. But that's typical of a grass. Right where the blade comes off, there's a little papery structure called a ligule. And these are all features that can be used to identify the specific species that you're looking at. And then grasses have these kind of knobby nodes that occur on the stem. So these little knots where the close to where the leaf blade comes off. Then we have rushes, which are generally round in shape. The culm is round. That's true of grasses as well. They have roundish culms in cross section. But the rushes will typically have a closed sheath. So where the leaf attaches to the culm, that sheath-like connection is closed. So when you pull on the blade, you're actually tearing the sheath rather than just opening it up. And rushes oftentimes will have leaf blades that are also round in cross section versus the blade-like flat leaf of a grass. And then sedges. Sedges should be everybody's favorite because sedges are so much fun, and they are triangular in cross section. So we like to use the mnemonic of sedges have edges. If you were to cut a cross section across the sedge stem, you would notice that it's a nice little triangle. The sheaths, again, tend to be closed like the rushes, and then you'll have these leaf blades coming off. So those are the general structures. Grasses have these usually kind of delicate inflorescences. So you might refer to this whole structure as the flowering head or the spike, and then the individual heads are spikelets. And then the sheaths and nodes and the ligule are all features that can be used for identifying this specific grass species. So this little table here, and if anybody's interested in having a copy of the slides later, let me know. I'm happy to share this out. But with the grasses, sedges, and rushes, the culm on the grass and rush tend to be cylindrical. On grasses, usually hollow, whereas the rushes have kind of a sponge-like pith to them. In some cases, grass culms can be more flattened as well. So there's always little variations on the theme. But then the sedges I mentioned are three-sided in the culm, so they have that triangular aspect. The leaf arrangement on a grass is that the leaves are two-ranked, and what that means is that the leaves come off generally in two directions, and if you were to orient yourself over the top of the plant, you could see the leaves coming off to either side, and they kind of line up down the plant in that manner. But with the sedges and rushes, those leaves tend to be three-ranked, so that they're actually coming off at 3 points, kind of radiating out. And you can observe that when you look down on the plant. It's very distinct in the sedges with that triangular culm, and with each one of those flat sides of the culm having a leaf blade projecting out from it, you can really see that kind of three-ranked aspect. Grass blades, the leaf blade is usually flat. For the sedges, it can be flat or folded. And then for the rushes, the leaves can be channeled or round. And on grasses, the leaf sheath is usually open or split. With sedges, usually closed. And then we've got examples in the rush family that can be open or closed. Grasses usually have this little papery ligule just at the base of the blade, but that feature is absent or insignificant on the sedges and rushes. And then auricles, which I didn't really mention, this again gets at the base of the grass blade. Sometimes there are little protuberances on either side that are referred to as auricles, and those will occur in the grasses, but we don't see them in the sedges and rushes. But another diagnostic character for identification of the grass. So here's an overview of some of the plants that we have in Ohio. I'll start with the rush family, which is Juncaceae, and talk about one of the two genera. The first being the true rushes, which is the genus Juncus. We have 24 Juncus species in Ohio. Most of these are facultative or wetter, meaning that they are predominantly wetland plants, more so than many groups. A lot of their individual species are notably tolerant of wet conditions. We only have 2 that are facultative upland species. We have 1 introduced species in the state. The others are native. And most of these are perennial, except for the Juncus euphonius, which is the toad rush. And that's an annual, so it reseeds itself each year. And the stems are rounded and solid with just a few leaves or reduced leaves. In the true rushes, the flowers consist of tepals, these little bract-like projections that surround a capsule which holds the seeds. And if you break these structures apart, you'll see that they have these similar physical attributes, but they may be ordered in different ways so that the plant has a very different appearance. So this is still tepals with seed capsules inside, as is this, but you can see how different those two inflorescences look. The sedge family, the Psypuriaceae, is an interesting one. I'm going to review 4 of the 16 genera. This is a cool little plant called Spicerush or Eleochris, and we've got 17 of those in Ohio. They are all on the wet side of the spectrum. So fac wet and obligate plants, they can be annual or perennial. And they have this terminal spikelet at the top of each plant, which is why they get their name Spicerush. If you break this inflorescence apart, you'll find these little achenes, which have bristles and what's called a tubercle, which looks like a little hat on the top of the achene. And those are used to identify the species predominantly. You'll be looking at the shape of the achene. This is a field full of water plantain and a whole bunch of rushes. And it's a little hard to see, but this is the leaf right here. And you notice there's not like a long blade coming off of the leaf. Is literally just the sheath, and it ends right there. You can kind of see the culm growing up out of it. But technically, this is the plant's leaf. But it consists of just the sheath, and there's no blade that really comes off of that. The Scirpus bulrushes are shown here. We have 8 species in Ohio. I should have noted that there's kind of a little guide to the stem characteristics. So bulrushes can have round or triangular stems. That's what that indicates in the upper left. We have 8 species in Ohio. They are all obligate. So this is a particularly wet group that resides in wetlands reliably. They're all perennials. They have a solid stem, and there's kind of a mixture of round and triangular stemmed bulrushes. The leaves are flat or folded with a midrib, so they're kind of a V formation if you cut them in cross section. And then the flower heads can be quite variable, as you see in these line drawings. They can look vastly different. And then this kind of indicates the 3-ranked leaves that you might see if you're looking at a top-down view. This dot represents the stem, and you would see the leaves radiating out in 3 directions. So that's a bulrush, Scirpus. We also have another group of bulrushes that we refer to as Schonoplectus. And so this is the soft stem bulrush I showed you earlier, and a few other species. They're also quite wet, obligate species, and we have 6 of these in Ohio within the Schonoplectus genus. By far the most common is called Schonoplectus tabernae montani, which is the soft stem bulrush that appears in a lot of our deeper marsh type wetlands. And then we have this group, the Psypuris or flat sedge group. And this is the one that you may be familiar with because it'll show up in your yard. I think farmers call them nutgrass or yellow nut sedge. We have 19 species in Ohio. They can be annual or perennial. Again, a three-angled stem. And they'll have a grouping of leaves that are directly beneath the inflorescence. Sorry, I'm not using my cursor on the right screen here. This is the inflorescence, and there will be 3 leaves that come off right below where that inflorescence occurs. There are a number of these that are more facultative upland species. So farmers will see them in their fields. You might find them in your backyard from time to time. They're pretty adaptable to drier conditions, but there are some that are known for occurring in wetlands and being more facultative wetland species. And then this is the challenge for botanists in our state. The group, the Carex or Carices, the true sedges. We have over 150 species in Ohio, and they are a challenge to learn, but most botanists like the challenge and like Carex sedges just because it's an acquired taste and an acquired skill to really get good at identifying these. They have triangular stems. The flower heads are quite variable. One of the interesting features with the true sedges is that the achene or the seed or nutlet grows in this husk that's referred to as a perigenium. And the size and shape of the perigenium, as well as the scale that tends to grow underneath the perigenium, is one way that we identify the species. So it's a really interesting group and very, very diverse group, and probably easily overlooked because they're generally low growing and grassy in appearance. But when you look closely, you'll see these very unique flowering structures. It's a fascinating group in that some of the plants are monoecious and some are dioecious, so that they either have male and female flowers together in a single spike, or they're separated into different spikes. So here's an example of one that has the staminate portion looking much different and elevated above the pistillate portion where the seeds would develop. Here, the staminate portion is actually below the pistillate portion on Carex squarosa there, the squarose sedge. And then this is another example of a staminate portion above the pistillate portion. But it's quite variable, and the positioning of the staminate and pistillate portions are used in the identification.
Mark, just for reference, we're at about 7:51 right now.
Okay, great. The grass family, I'll give you 3 species, or 3 of the genera here. This is what the spikelet looks like. This is the flower of the grass. I'm not going to go into all the technical details there, but these are the different features that we use diagnostically. And this first grass is called woodreed, and it is very indicative of a forested wetland condition. We see these frequently in forested settings in the understory. They tolerate some shade, and it's actually a very attractive grass. And then we have bluegrass, and some of our bluegrass species actually occur in wetlands. One of the things we look for to identify a bluegrass is that the leaves have this kind of a boat-shaped tip. It looks like the tip of a canoe, which is kind of interesting. And then we have manna grass, The one shown is called foul manna grass, and I have to relate a story of seeing foul manna grass at Highlands Park when there was a new brood of baby mallards that had hatched out. And I was there one day. Unfortunately, wasn't able to get a video of this. I don't think my phone took video at the time. But I watched these little ducklings that, you know, are 6 inches tall waddle over to the edge, and they were looking up at this towering foul manna grass that, you know, was probably 2 feet over their heads. And they literally leapt up into the air, grabbed a hold of the inflorescence and pulled it down to the ground as they fell. And then they would put their foot down on it so they could hold it in place and nibble all the seeds off. It was the cutest thing. I've never seen ducklings leap like that, but they were very fond of this foul manna grass as a food source. We had an interesting find in Westerville when we did a project for the city that expanded a wetland area. And this plant showed up after the excavation. It wasn't known from the area. And it's called pale umbrella sedge. And we actually think that the seeds were buried in the soil and exposed when we expanded the wetland area and removed some of that overburden, and probably exposed the original seed bank so that this plant grew. And we got a little write-up in the local paper on the pale umbrella sedge. This plant has since been delisted because it's been found in many other areas of the state, and now we know that we have stable populations of the plant around. This is a general view of some of the common sedges. Some of them have these very big inflated paragenia, and these species tend to grow in floodplains where the seed head breaks apart and the paragenia acts like a flotation device, allowing the seeds to distribute across the floodplain. So that's a pretty unique adaptation as well. And then we have some other interesting flowering plants, things like our native iris, the blue flag, some more sedges. And the one thing I wanted to point out here is that even dead during the dormant period of the year, we can still identify where water collects on the landscape due to the presence of standing wetland vegetation. So this is a stand-up cattail in the middle of this field. Even though it's not actively growing in the scene, it's identifiable as an obligate wetland plant, and we could identify the presence of a wetland based on that. So that's everything I had short of the quiz. So I guess I want to ask, do you want to, let's see how we do here. So what adaptation is being exhibited by this grass? Maybe we can just have our participants respond in the chat. I don't know if I can actually see the chat though.
If you click on it on the bottom, it should show up on one of the screens, but somebody answered C.
C, yes, those are adventitious roots. And I was excited to observe this because I didn't realize until I started teaching a lab at Ohio State that grasses would also grow these adventitious roots. This is unfortunately an invasive species called Phragmites, but it's growing in the wetlands at OSU. And when the water is deep, it sprouts extra roots at the nodes of the plant. So that is correct. This is a plant called bladdernut. How do you think this floodplain's shrubs are dispersed? This is definitely a term that I didn't cover, but you might be able to narrow it down.
Somebody mentions D in chat.
D. So squirrels and wind. Actually, the correct answer is hydrocory, which is a term used to describe distribution with water. So the plants, these are like little balloon-like flotation devices like the paragenia that I mentioned on graze sedge that I showed you earlier. And so this bladdernut will drop its seeds and they float around with the river flow and tend to deposit out in areas at the edge of that flood prone area where they will be likely to germinate and grow successfully. So it's kind of an interesting way to disperse seeds. So we talked about the indicator status. What do you think the indicator status of the plant in this photo might be?
Mott says C.
That is correct. It is an obligate. You can actually see that it's got this adaptation to float on water. That's a pretty good indication. The leaves that are further towards the shore, so to speak, are standing above the water, but it also does quite well floating on the water. Anybody ever seen this spectacular looking plant and know its name?
All right, Marty and Mott say D.
That's correct. That's the marsh marigold. And if you like just spectacular scenes in nature, I encourage you to go to Cedar Bog in I think it's April. The marsh marigold blooms, and there's just blankets of this yellow flower across that site. It's really, really nice.
All right, Mark, if I can ask some of the questions from the chat so far.
Sure.
So are all of the water features near new developments basins, you know, where the land drops and you got pretty little fountains?
Uh-huh. The question is basically, are they stormwater basins?
Yes.
Yes. Typically, I mean, I'm sure there are some exceptions where a developer decides they just want a pond for an aesthetic, but the new developments are required to develop in such a way that their post-development runoff does not exceed the pre-development runoff. And as soon as you start developing a property, you're adding more impervious surface, so you're going to get more runoff. And in order to meet that objective of not exceeding your pre-development runoff rate, then you have to create these storage spaces in the form of detention basins to hold that water for a period of time and release it more slowly. So that's the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
But I'm always advocating for developers and communities to think about whether a simple rock-lined basin is the way to go, or if they can actually restore or create wetlands to provide additional natural function beyond just storing water and releasing it slowly. Because I think we can get creative about it if we try.
Okay, and that was actually goes into the next question. Do developers have to maintain a percentage of wetland if they drain a wetland in order to build it?
There is really no requirement that they avoid any of their wetlands. So if a developer so chooses, they could have their development footprint annihilate all the wetlands on the property. But there are implications. Their permitting may be a little bit more difficult, and they have potentially increasing mitigation costs in order to offset their impacts. So the regulatory agencies and consultants such as ourselves advocate for trying to come up with a good site design that avoids wetlands where possible, because you not only avoid impairing that local environment, but you reduce your expense in terms of mitigation. Because if you impact an acre of, let's say, moderate quality wetland, you would be required as a developer to mitigate for 2 acres, because we have these things called mitigation ratios based on the quality of the wetland. So if it's what we call a category 2 wetland, you impact an acre, you have to mitigate it at 2 acres for the acre impacted. And the going rate for mitigation credit is about $60,000 an acre. So you'd have about $120,000 in expense right off the bat to mitigate that impact, plus the cost of the environmental studies before and after, the permitting that goes into it. You know, you might be looking at $150,000 price tag. So there's financial incentives to avoid wetlands in addition to environmental responsibility.
Okay. Well, is there a tax break or other incentive for individuals or developers or businesses to include wetland features into their design?
There are various grant programs and in some instances, some opportunity for some cost relief tax-wise, I believe. But I think the biggest incentive is not having to go through the permit process and offsite mitigation and the expense associated with that. But right now, it's a very good time for wetlands in the state, because we've got a state administration that is taking wetland restoration very seriously. We're all concerned about the health of Lake Erie and our other inland lakes and the frequency and severity of harmful algal blooms. And we're realizing that the better we do at protecting wetlands to protect those ecosystem services, the better our quality of life will be. We'll have fewer issues with the health of our lakes. We can enjoy our lakes. We don't have to worry about the shutdown of our water plants like they had in Toledo when Lake Erie was getting particularly bad with harmful algal blooms. And so we're seeing a lot of wetland restoration and different types of incentives and governmental programs that can help communities find ways to protect and enhance their wetland resources.
Okay, and it looks like Mott shared, if you're in chat, he shared an article. It says it looks like there might be a bill in the Ohio State Legislature to give some tax benefits for wetlands, and that was just on June 24th. So thank you, Mott.
Yeah.
Yeah. Going down, are there resources to help homeowners to address areas that stay wet after significant rains?
Yes. There's our Franklin Soil and Water Conservation District has a like a backyard mini grant type program that can help to offset some of the costs. I don't think it's going to cover a lot of expense, but they certainly have the ability to provide some technical advice. And we have a growing number of nurseries that are carrying appropriate native species that do well in created wetlands or rain gardens. So that's a good solution, is rather than trying to change the water situation or drain things more quickly, just finding the appropriate plants for that area, maybe even modifying the shape and depth of that area where water collects to kind of accentuate that effect and create a little wetland garden is a beneficial way to go. And it's getting easier and easier to find the plant sources you need as a homeowner to fill in a space like that. The way I look at these rain gardens and like wetland gardens is, we're all very familiar with raised beds. A wetland is just a lowered bed. Instead of building it up and planting on top of it, you dig it down and plant into the bottom. And if water collects there on a routine basis, but it keeps the rest of your yard drier and keeps the plants in the depression happy, it can be a really nice thing to have in your lot.
I'm going to go ahead and share that Google page that shows. Yeah, so these are some of the ones that come up, and they highlight the different areas. So if you wanted to go around the city or area, depending on where you are.
Yeah, can you zoom in on that specific location that he described?
Oh yeah, it's
Sharon Woods Wetlands Sanctuary. And it's
got pictures. It's got a picture of a house, but there you go.
Wow. That,
Thank you, Mark.
that's interesting.
I
Yeah, I'm
was
gonna have
also
to
curious
check that
about
out.
some of the areas on the Google Maps that show up when you type in the word wetlands. They say experimental wetland number 1 and experimental wetland number 2. Some of them seem to be located near other wetland institutions that have a name, but I was kind of curious about those also.
Can you bring that screen up again? I think that a couple of those may be the experimental wetlands at Ohio State, which is where I teach my wetland lab. So the Wilma Shiremeyer Olentangy River Wetland Research Park has a couple of
Yes,
experimental
that's
wetlands.
what one of the experimental wetlands was located next to, what you just said, that long phrase.
Yeah, yeah, that's. Yep, yeah, that's OSU. So my one of my mentors who wrote a textbook entitled Wetlands is Dr. Bill Mitch, and he started that outdoor learning space for Ohio State and created 2 kidney-shaped wetlands that he referred to as Wetland 1 and Wetland 2, that he kind of ran a long-ranging experiment on looking at how wetlands changed over time. And the grand experiment was to see if planting one wetland and not planting the other made any real difference over time, or if the wetlands ended up kind of developing in a similar way over time.
All right. Does anyone have any other questions? This was very interesting. Thank you so much. I know, and I have seen those plants before. Every plant you showed, I was like, I've seen that.
Yeah.
But I had no idea.
Yep.
The stuff that comes up in the garden center all that often.
Right, right. Well, if you're ever looking at a plant and you're just dying to know what it is, you know, feel free to reach out to me. I always like getting those random texts like, what is this? Shoot me a photo and I'll try to identify it for you.
Amazing. All right. Well, Mark, this was great. Thank you so much. And everyone, I am keeping an eye on chat. It looks you're starting to get thank yous. So good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I can, on behalf of everyone, I can ask if you could send me the slides.
Yes.
Because some of those pictures I will want to reference, and I will make sure to send those out to everyone.
All right.
All right.
I can do that. And just as a reminder, if anybody's doing the Western Flora tour, our house is 1084 East College Avenue. Hopefully we'll see some of you there and we can show you both some wetland plants and some non-wetland plants.
That's fantastic. All right.
But lots of natives. That's what we're
Yay.
focusing on. So.
That's what we want to hear.
Yep.
Okay, well, once again, thank you for a wonderful program. And I am going to keep my eyes peeled in. I am planning a couple of walks based on this alone. So
Great, great.
yeah.
Well, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. All right. Well, thank you. And you have a good evening. And everybody, thank you for coming. And keep an eye out for the email that has both a link to the video, the chat, and Mark's PowerPoint. And Mark, I will send you an original copy of the video for you to keep and do with what you will.
Okay.
All right. Everybody have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.